So yeah, I was notified by my father there that they people within his apartment complex catch up on the Bible study on YouTube, and so they watch it as well over there. So at least I'm happy about that. I'm getting into the double digits with views. So I'm not into the thousands or millions yet. Maybe it'll get there at some stage, But I have seen some videos online that are in the tens of billions of views. So now I don't aspire to that kind of thing. As long as somebody gets something out of this, that's fine. So, but anyway, so we're doing gonna touch on the Passover today a little more, and then work on the actual exodus of getting out of Egypt, because as we've said in the past, a lot of our maps that we have in our Bibles, I would say based on more current archaeological evidence, would say that those maps are actually wrong. And so there is a much better sort of idea out there as to where these things are. And since they've gone to these places, they have found lots of archaeological evidence that the Israelites indeed passed through those particular areas. So so it's great that the Bible is substantiated by archaeology. So because it's true, it's not a fantasy. So let's get ourselves moved over and just talk about the Passover for a bit here. So this is Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1 to 13. That says this. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months, and it shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of persons, according to each man's need. You shall make your account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male the first year, and you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight, and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it, and then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat it raw nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head, with its legs and its entrails. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. And what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire, and thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, with sandals on your feet. You shall staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Now, the reason I read a big long passage like that is really just to give you the sense and the idea of what is happening here. This is just letting the oops, because at Passover is one of these red asterisk things. It's about the scarlet thread of redemption that is going through the Bible. And as you can see in the picture here, you have a family, a Jewish family, or I should say Hebrew family, because the Jews is about the people that are from the tribe of Judah. Okay, so that's when we're talking about Jew. The term Jew is not used until the New Testament. So, but anyway, we tend to sort of use Jew and Hebrew sort of in the same sense, but in actual fact, the Hebrews is a larger group of people compared to the Jews. But anyway, so we have a Hebrew family here taking blood from the sacrifice of the lamb that was sacrificed on the 14th day of the of this month, and which is the month Nisan to them. And as it says in the beginning of this verse, it was God says, "This shall be the beginning of months to you now." Now, their calendar up until that point, their year, which was their civil year, started in September with what was called Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Hashanah is literally translated the head of the year, or head of the head of the year. So that was the beginning of the civil calendar. So if you look at a Hebrew calendar today, I think it's like 5,000 and something. I didn't get a chance to look that up. So their calendar goes way, way back. We're in 2024, but that's because that goes back to the, in and around the birth of Christ. Now, the birth of Christ was probably more like around 4 BC, but anyway, our calendar is based around the birth of Jesus Christ. So it's, 2,000 and some odd years. The Hebrew calendar starts way before that. Okay. So, so the head of their year started in September. Now, God is stepping into their time, and he's saying, look, it's right, and we're going to change the calendar. We're going to change the when things start. And so things are now going to start not in September, but they're going to start in either late March or April, depending on when this particular month starts. So it's interesting that God is stepping into time here, and he says, right, we're no longer going to be looking at things from a civil and secular perspective here. We're looking at things from a spiritual perspective, because when things really start for you is when you leave Egypt, that when you exit, when you get out, so really, I have a birthday today, April 19th. Okay. That's when I was born 58 years ago. So, yeah. So, no, did I forget to mute them? Sorry. If you all could go and mute yourselves.
Right. Okay.
I forgot to mute you all.
Okay. You see those herbs?
Yeah.
Was that something to do with the captivity? And is that why they had to be bitter herbs?
Yes, and I'll talk about that in a second. So
okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Because my birthday again is the 19th, but when I was born again, when I actually left the captivity of my life, which was my Egypt, and everybody has your respective Egypts. The day and hour I got saved was, I would say, late summer 1977. I can't sort of put a day on it as such, but that's when I became born again. Okay, so that's kind of the same sentiment that's going on here. God is saying, look, you all were born, as a nation, sometime before this, which they were, with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, so on and so forth, and they spent 400 years in Egypt. But now God is saying, look, the date, the time is changing. And so this is going to be the start. This is the beginning of months for you. So Now, Rosh Hashanah is still in September, so that the head of their year, their civil calendar, is still in September, but their religious calendar starts in April. So, in fact, Passover right now for the Jew is, I think, this weekend, I think. So, and their festival of unleavened bread and all that sort of stuff is all from I think Monday for the week. So so this is when their Passover is. But anyway, so and it all has to do with when the full moon is after the first day of spring, and all these sorts of things, because their Passover, the Hebrew Passover, always falls on a full moon. So it revolves around the lunar calendar as opposed to a solar calendar, which is what we use, because every 7 years they have to add an extra month to their system because of just how they work their calendar. So sometimes we don't get these things. It's like, why on earth would they do that? But in a lot of ways, it was a lot easier to look up in the sky and track the moon and see how it was going than it was to figure out what a solar year, would have been, which was 365 days. But a lunar year with 12 cycles is roughly around 360 days. So there's 5 years of a difference. So so you have to, every 7 years you then end up with another 30 odd days. And so you have to add an extra month into it. So you're probably going, good night, what do we do with this? So anyway, it worked. So, but suffice to say that this calendar started at this particular time. But so what they were instructed to do by God was they were told to take the blood of the sacrificed lamb, who was without blemish, 1 year old. It was a male. And they took blood with hyssop, and hyssop was a rather stiff sort of very common plant. It grew up on walls and all kinds of things. So they would take hyssop, dip it in the blood, and then they would put it up on the lintel piece of the door, and then the 2 door posts. And it's a wonderful picture of the Lord Jesus Christ, because Jesus, when he had his crown placed on his head, there was blood. There was the head, or the blood on his hands, which would be the 2 door posts. And then as that blood from the lintel dripped down and hit the ground, then you have the feet of the Lord Jesus Christ that was nailed. So it's a wonderful picture of the way, the door, and Jesus is making this way. So now some commentators would say that the blood was not applied on the outside of the door. It was applied on the inside. Now, I can understand the arguments for both, but the idea of it being on the inside of the door was that this was something that was applied to the heart. It was something that was applied to the inside of yourself, because you can put on exterior things, and all of us have played Christianity. We've put on airs and graces, and we've passed ourselves, and all that kind of stuff. And but what God is concerned with is what goes on actually inside of our hearts. And so there is a verse later on in this passage where it talks about the Israelites did not leave their houses, and they applied the blood. So if they didn't leave their house, they couldn't go outside then to put the blood on. So the blood had to be put on the inside of the door. So so it's just an interesting thing to think about. But it's when God then saw the blood that he then passed over. And hence that's why it's called the Passover. Okay. So but that happened at night, and the Hebrew people were required to stay up at night and to watch, and that That was called in Hebrew Lei Shiburim, which was the night of watching. And so they would stay up and they would watch to make sure that God passed over, because they would have been in neighborhoods where perhaps there was I would say the majority of the Israelites were probably in the land of Goshen, where, they were pretty much all collected. But I would say there would have been Hebrew people that were intermixed with other neighborhoods where there would have been Egyptian people. So if you can imagine sort of hearing a wind, coming through, and you're up at night waiting and watching, and you hear a scream come from your Egyptian's neighbor because they didn't believe in the blood on the door. They didn't bother doing that. And then they discovered that their firstborn was dead. And then the wind came and it went over your house because you had blood on your door. So it was a very tense moment. It was but you were very, very relieved, at the end of the night of watching, so the Hebrew people, throughout the ages then would have had this night of watching. So they would have sacrificed their lamb at midnight and done all those things. And they would have done their celebration and had their night of watching and remembering how God then passed over their house. So now Bobby had asked there earlier about the bitter herbs, because what they ate was the lamb, and they ate unleavened bread, and that was to signify a couple of different things. Leaven was generally always associated in the Bible with sin, and so the bread was could not have leaven in it. So therefore, if it didn't have leaven in it, it was pretty flat, like a cracker. And so it's what the Jews would use today is called matzah. So very, very breakable and striped and all that kind of thing. There's some churches that would use matzah in their communion services. And sometimes what they would say is, because of the stripes that are on these crackers, the matzah, it signifies that Jesus, by his stripes, we are healed. That he had stripes put on his back. And so that bread that was beaten is significant of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, but they also had to eat in haste. So there was no time for the bread to actually rise. And so they basically just, threw it together quick, because God was saying, look, as soon as this happens, as soon as this takes place, bang, we're out of here. No messing around. It's time to exit this life. Now, the bitter herbs is significant of helping the nation of Israel to remember the harshness of the old life. Because sometimes people would remember back into the old life and say, oh, there were some good times. And the Israelites did this. They says, yeah, didn't we have the leeks and the garlics and the onions and the cucumbers and fish? Wasn't it great? Whoa. And that's what they were remembering, was a few foodstuffs that taste good. I can't understand about a cucumber, to be honest. Me and cucumbers don't really get on terribly well. I gag, but anyway, that's what they were into. But all those things are tasty, but they're very superficial. They don't provide really anything. If you had a diet of cucumbers, you'd die. So mixed with a few oniony sort of things. But God was going to give them something a lot more substantial. And the bitter herbs were there to say, look, you remember back there, it was a bitter life. It was a bad life. And so God is taking you to a better place, a place flowing with milk and honey. So that's just a picture there, really, of the idea of a family being involved in placing the blood on the door. Now, the Passover Seder feast that would happen for centuries after this, which we looked at last week about the 4 different cups There's actually 15 different steps within the Seder feast. There's a lot of singing. There's a lot of prayers. There's the washing of hands. There's the actual hiding of a piece of bread, and the children are also very much involved with the Seder feast. So it's a very, very family oriented exercise. So we'll get to the actual Exodus here now. So now, in terms of the lay of the land here, this is our zone of problem in this day and age. You can see the Gaza Strip up in the top part of the map there, just north of the word Israel, and that's where the Gaza war is happening currently. And the Red Sea is the body of water that is down below, and then it forks off into two fingers. And the one on your right is the Gulf of Aqaba, and then the one on the left is the Gulf of Suez. And it's up the Suez finger is where you have the Suez Canal, which goes through Egypt, and that's where big ships pass through and go into the Mediterranean Sea. So you can see Cairo there and that kind of thing. I just took a clip off of Google Maps. Now, I was looking at all kinds of other maps and all kinds of other things to try to say, okay, how can we display this? But I thought, no, I'm going to do it myself. So I found ways of actually making some movement on these maps. So a lot of old the old maps, or the maps where they say the Red Sea crossing took place, was up the Gulf of Suez somewhere, and really, when you read the biblical narrative about the Red Sea crossing, there's nothing up there that actually lends itself to that topography. It just doesn't seem to work terribly well. Now, I remember watching a BBC program a lot of years ago about how they came up with all these strange and wonderful ideas about how the 10 plagues happened and how the Red Sea crossing happened. And I mean, it was incredibly fanciful. And they linked all the 10 plagues together and basically came up with some sort of a natural way that all this took place. And then they said, well, the Red Sea crossing really wasn't across the Red Sea. It was what was called the Reed Sea. And the Reed Sea would have been more up where you see Port Said, up sort of north there. Because, and the way that the Israelites would have crossed the Reed Sea was that there was a volcano in the Mediterranean Sea up near Greece that blew its top in and around that time and created a tidal wave. And what happens with a tidal wave is that it sucks all the water out before it comes crashing over. And so they says, well, what happened was the volcanic eruption with its associated earthquake created a tidal wave, sucked all the water out, which gave opportunity for 2 to 3 million people to cross this Reed Sea without getting their feet wet. And then the subsequent tsunami then came and wiped out all the Egyptians. Dead on, right over. So no, I don't think so. That's not what happened, because that does not concur with the biblical narrative. So really what happened here, and this is where Goshen is in that part of the world, is that the Israelites then traveled from Goshen down to a beach on the Gulf of Aqaba. So they traveled. There was 2 to 3 million of them that would have come at this particular point at this beach. Now, this is where I'll zoom in on this in a second, but it was in and around this very, very mountainous area where Pharaoh says the wilderness has bewildered them, because they would have been hemmed in by a mountain valley, and would have been stuck, because if they were ended up on this beach, and then you have this body of water, and the Red Sea crossing then would happen right about there. Okay, so let's see if I have yeah. So we're going to go and zoom in on this particular part of the world here. So let's do that. Boink. Okay. So now there's so they would have traveled down and came into this beach. That's where the Israelites would have come. They would have stopped there. There was a pillar of cloud, which is the God in his presence, would have led them to this particular part. And it was a pillar of fire by day, and a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to give them light. And it says that when they got to this particular part of the world, to the Red Sea, that the pillar of cloud then moved between the army of Israel and the army of Pharaoh to basically keep them separated. And so Moses then says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. God says, move forward, go forward. Well, I'm sure everybody was like going into forward into what? There's the sea. So we have mountains on the left hand, right hand, Pharaoh's army's behind us, and then there's a beach in front of us. So what do? And God's telling us to go forward. And so, but this is where God sends an east wind, which then carves out this part of the Red Sea, and the Bible says that they went over on dry ground, and there was a wall of water on the right hand and a wall of water on the left. So if you can imagine, if you were a fish or a whale and swimming along going, why is there people down there? So because oddly enough, my little pointer thing's not working really well, but the northern part of the Sea of Aqaba is incredibly deep. The southern part from the beach is incredibly deep. So it's like 2,000 feet deep on either side. But see, right at that beachhead, there's a land bridge that's only a couple of 100 feet deep. So so this is where they would have crossed right there. And so the slope would have gone down a bit and then leveled out and then come up the other side. But it was not a 2,000 foot drop. It was there was a bit of land there that was not too far under the water.
Was Moses divinely led there, or would he have been there?
No, he would have been divinely led there. He wouldn't have known that necessarily. No. So I would say because where Moses would have been exiled to was over in this part of the world. Okay. So see that little green bit down in the lower right-hand corner? That's where Mount Sinai is. So you can actually go visit it today. So so that's where Moses met God at the burning bush. So he would have been aware of this area, obviously lived there for 40 years, but in terms of understanding that that would have been a shallowish area. Now, it wasn't shallow. It was still a couple 100 feet deep, but it wasn't 2,000 feet deep. So so I would say he was divinely led to that particular point, because that was the place where there was a bit of a slope, and then that would work that way. So so the Israelites, once they get to the other side, would have wandered around a little bit, and then they would have gotten to that green thing, which is where Mount Sinai is, which is where they would have received the 10 Commandments and all those things. So now let me just take this and okay. Now this is from Google Earth. Okay, and so this is looking east. So if you see this area here, which is where the Israelites would have traveled, and you can see the mountain ranges that are there, the valley. So you can see how they would be trapped. If you're being pursued down this wash, you'd have a problem going backwards. So they're heading into a serious situation. So unless God did something, they were going to be cooked. So they get to the beach, which is there on the other side. And so God then creates a way, which is then kind of shooting across there. That distance is about 9.5 miles, okay, across to the other side. So it is a big enough distance. If you've ever been to Loch Ness, if you can go to the widest part, the Loch Ness is about 7 by 10, about 7 by 10 miles. So if you went to, say, Tomb Bridge and you look south to the other end down to Oxford Island, that's the distance roughly of what we're talking about. So that's a fair enough jaunt. But God says that it was on dry ground, and they got there. So it wasn't sloshing through a reed sea. It wasn't going through a marsh. And then they would have gone out the other side, and then that would have taken them a couple of weeks to do that. So and now zooming in again, so you can see the beach up on the upper left-hand corner. So they would have gone across this way, and then you can see this is very, very mountainous. And then they would have traveled around through here and came to this particular point. And this point here, where that red dot is in chapter 17 of Exodus, where the people started to complain about not having water. And so Moses was then instructed by God, took him to a rock and says, hit this rock. And then water will come out. Now there is another time where God had told Moses about getting water, but he said to him, speak to the rock. Now it wasn't that same rock, it was another rock. But the problem is that Moses was frustrated and he smacked the rock anyway. And because of that disobedience, Moses was then not allowed to go into the promised land. But at this particular point, there was a rock that was hit and it was split and water came out of it. And then they moved on from there to the base of Mount Sinai, which is where they got the Ten Commandments. So this is a very, very arid, rugged area. Now, where the Israelites ended up camping, and you can see sort of between the split rock red bit and the little green thing, there's a bit of a flat area. And that is where the Israelites would have basically set up camp for then the duration of all what was received from Mount Sinai, the rest of Exodus, rest of Leviticus, and a good bit of Numbers. And then they moved on from there. So this whole journey, by the time they get here to this point, is about 2 months after they leave Egypt. So now it says in the book of Deuteronomy that the time that it would have taken them to actually get to the promised land from this point north was 11 days. And it took them 40 years. And that's because they disobeyed God. So, and then everybody died of that generation, and then was the new generation that went in, except for two men that trusted God. And we'll look at that situation in Numbers with the 12 spies and all that. But that was Joshua and Caleb. They were the only two men that actually got into the promised land from the generation of people that left Egypt. So now, on either side of the Gulf of Aqaba here, where there's where you have the beach or the two beaches there, there are these pillars. These exist. These were found by an archaeologist initially, a guy called Ron Wyatt back in the 70s. And this particular pillar is the one that I think is the one over in the first beach. And then there was an identical one that was found on the other side. Now, the first pillar didn't have any inscription on it. It had all been sort of wore away. It's about, to give you an idea of how tall that thing is, it's about 14, 15 feet. So it's a pretty tall thing. So much taller than what our, height of our ceiling here is. And there was an identical one on the other side, but it did have an inscription on it. And it was built in Solomon's time, probably by Solomon's people, to commemorate the Red Sea crossing. So you had two pillars on either side of this Gulf of Aqaba, basically saying this is where the Red Sea crossing took place. And so the inscriptions that were on the pillar that's on the Saudi Arabia side lends itself to all the different sort of bits and pieces about the Red Sea crossing. So the Red Sea crossing didn't happen way over in Goshen somewhere. Okay. So now these pillars have been moved about. They've been but that's what happens when I get excited. I take my microphone and send it flying. But very interesting sort of piece of archaeology that's there. Now, there's another thing that is very interesting in terms of what this rock looks like, in terms of the rock that Moses would have hit in the Bible and water came forth. It looks like that. And that is what they refer to as the split rock of Horeb. Now, the reason Sinai, this area is to be in Saudi Arabia is because in the book of Galatians, it says that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. So, there's not much guesswork there. So the only reason Mount Sinai in your Bibles, in terms of, these old maps, is down at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula is because Constantine's wife, and Constantine was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, his wife had a dream and says that's where Mount Sinai is. That was based on a woman's dream. Or a man's dream, but it was, her dream. It wasn't based on anything substantive. So, but anyway, so if you were to go to this rock today, which you can, probably have to pay a fair bit of money to get there. But this rock sits on top of a hill. It's about 60 feet tall, that particular rock. And if you go to the base of that rock, you will see evidence of water having come out of the base. Now, this is a completely arid, unforgiving area. There's not a drop of water to be seen. But yet there is all this evidence on top of this hill of water coming out of this rock. So, go figure. So now just south of this, where Mount Sinai is, that is Mount Sinai. So that's the high mountain sort of in the back. And it is very, very blackened. And so you can see that it is a lot darker. And it's not just a cloud that's, or a shadow or something like that. It's dark. And the Bible talks about how thunderings and lightnings and smoke and all kinds of stuff came from God down into Mount Sinai. So it's burnt. But that's where Moses would have gone in order to get the 10 Commandments. Now, sort of speeding up a little bit to chapter 32 of Exodus, which is where the golden calf was, because Moses was up in the mountain for so long, the people said to Aaron, look, make us a god, and make us an idol. And so in and around this area, there is all kinds of other evidence that there was a worship of a calf. And now it's probably hard to see, but it's up in this rock. This is not the only little thing that's found in this area. There's loads of other things. But just to zoom in, that is a picture of a calf. And you can see then people up on the top of it there dancing around. So there's these hieroglyphs, these things that are on rocks all over this area depicting calf worship. And it's only here. The thing with the you can see the eye of the calf. It's two little horns coming up, or not two little horns, or big horns. And that's it. It's, I may have to, hang on, I'll point it out. So that's its front leg, that's its head, little is his horns, and that's his body. And then we have a person dancing about, and then another person dancing about here. Okay. So, yeah. So, it's just, it's fascinating that this stuff is here. So, again, this is not fantasy. This is real stuff. So, and you look this business up, it's all there. But, so what I basically wanted to do is give you a more visual sort of tour in terms of the Exodus and what very likely took place. Now, when they arrived at Sinai, this was where things started to change. And so how we're going to finish up here is really the start of a new era, because prior to this, God's laws and God's way of doing things was only by word of mouth. It was oral. It was not written down. Okay, so they did not have the law as such. So, chapter 19, verse 1 to 25. I know that's a lot of verses, but again, I think it's important to read what the story is. And then my voice will probably go after that. So in the third month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, so in the third month, that means they're at least 2 months into it. Okay, 2 months after they left, so they're in the third month. So they're probably 9 weeks, 9-10 weeks after they've left. On the same day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai, for they had departed from Rephidim, and Rephidim is where they had the encounter with the Amalekites. That was back in chapter 17, where Joshua was fighting the Amalekites. Moses was on top of the hill, and as long as he had his arms raised, the Israelites were winning. When he dropped his hands, the Israelites then started to lose. And so he got tired holding his hands up to God. And so Aaron and another guy called Hur, they came, put a rock under him, and then held his arms up all day, and the Israelites won. And it just is a story really about, putting your hands up to God and looking to the Lord for help. So they had departed from Rephidim, and they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded them. And then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak to you and believe you forever. So God is laying out clearly here that the Israelites are a special people. They're here to hear my voice. God is the one that brought them out of Egypt. He was the one that bore them, as it says there, on eagle's wings, meaning that the visual picture there is that the God is like the mother or the dad eagle, okay? And when the nest is being stirred up for the eaglets to get out and fly themselves, they're very, very happy just to stay in the nest because they're getting fed, but they have to be kicked out, basically, and in order to fly and to mature. And so when the Bible talks about bearing them up on the eagle's wings, the parent eagle would create an updraft so that these little eaglets that have never flown before can then be on a cushion of air, and then they learn how to fly because the parent eagle is underneath of them, creating this safety. And so that's the imagery that God is using, is he's saying, look, you were, I'm underneath of you creating safety, and I've brought you out with a strong arm. And so he says about the obedience to his voice and his covenant and so on. So the people then answer this and say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So this is really the start here of the era of the law, and we'll talk about this in a second. So Moses told all the words of the people to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people, and you shall set bounds of the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. And whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow, whether man or beast, he shall not live. And then when the trumpets sound long, they shall come near to the mountain. So, God's given very, very specific instructions here about, this is the mountain where God is. You may come to it, but you don't touch it, because God cannot be interfered with. And so Moses went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day, and do not come near your wives. And then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there was thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke. God answered him by voice. And then the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called to Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And then the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. So, and then there's one more bit here. And then Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it. And then the Lord said to him, get away, get down, and then come up, you and Aaron with you, and do not let the priests or the people break through to come to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. So God is setting out very, very sternly that there is a division here. God is holy, his people are to be consecrated, but you can't mix the two. There is a dividing line, where God is and where the people are. And that division is there clear up into the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ. And when we look at the tabernacle and stuff like that, we'll see that there is a curtain of division, because in the most holy place, that's where God is. Man can come to what's called the holy place, not the most holy place, but there's a curtain. And when Jesus Christ died, it says that the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom, which gave access then for the people then to go directly to God. And so throughout the Old Testament, there's this division that where God requires certain things of the people, requires worship, obedience, those kinds of things. But they don't have the privilege like Moses to be able to be in the presence of God. So, and that's not until Jesus Christ comes. But just to sort of back off a little bit and see where this sits in the greater space of history, there's what is called dispensations or periods. Now this is taken from C.I. Scofield, who kind of did a lot of this sort of work. But basically, does everybody know what the two parts of the Bible are? You got the Old Testament and you got the New Testament. Okay. So those are your two basic periods, okay, of time in the Bible. You have, the old way, the old agreement, which is what a testament is. Jesus Christ introduced the New Testament, the new agreement. Things are going to be done in a better way, because Jesus Christ did not come to abolish the law; he came to fulfill the law. So basically, you have these two things, but underneath these two broad periods, you have then sort of sub-periods. So let me just look at one of those initially, which is the age of innocence, which didn't last all that long, really. That's Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and that is from Adam's creation to the fall. That's the first two chapters of Genesis. Bang, that's it. Doesn't last very long. So, but that is a dispensation. That is a period of time. The next period is what Scofield referred to as moral responsibility, and that occurred from the fall to the end of the flood. Those chapters, Genesis chapters 3 to 8. But from that particular thing, you get other sorts of things, which we'll look at in a minute. But we'll just look at the two periods that sit under the New Testament. So in the New Testament, there is the church age, which starts from Acts chapter 2, and that's the day of Pentecost, to the rapture, which is where the church gets received into a cloud where we meet the Lord in the air, as it talks about in First Thessalonians chapter 5, or 4 and 5, 4, yeah. So there is the church age, and then there is the kingdom age, which is the 1,000-year reign of Christ, which is mentioned in the book of Revelation. So under the New Testament, there are these two periods of time. We're sitting in the church age right now. Now, not all churches buy into this type of thing. The Reformed Church, which would be like Presbyterianism and the like, they view this quite differently. This idea of dispensationalism is quite Baptist, Pentecostal, that kind of those types of churches, brethren and such. And now there is another kind of type of thinking, which is called progressive dispensationalism, which I'm not going to stand here and pretend I know all about that either, but that's some halfway house between those two. So now going back to moral responsibility, it is in this particular framework is where you have three other dispensations. One of them is when human government actually comes into being, and that's under Nimrod with the Tower of Babel and all that kind of stuff. So, people are actually then coming together to govern themselves, as opposed to being governed by, guess who? God. So there is no theocracy at that time. It's, could be democracy, probably not. It's more monarchy and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, it's human government. So that's from the end of the flood, with Ham, or the sons of Noah, up to the call of Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis. So it was interesting. I was watching the other night, Ant and Deck's, Limitless Win, the game show, and one of the questions that was asked was how many people were on Noah's Ark. And you see the people that were asked that question, and if they could answer that, they were going to win more than $1 million quid. They had no idea. Absolutely no idea. They went, there's a lot of animals on it. Yeah, well, we're not talking about lots of animals here. We're talking about people, and so, but because we live in a day and age where people are biblically ignorant, they didn't know. Does anybody know what the answer to that is off the top of your head? 8. Yep. Eight people. So there was Noah, Mrs. Noah, and the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. So that's 8. So if you were sitting in that hot seat, you would have won yourself 12 or 1.2 million or something. Anyway. Well, yeah. Yes, that's right. So they cashed in and got 50,000 pounds. So now the third dispensation underneath of what I would call the moral responsibility here is the time of promise, and that's from Genesis chapter 12 up to Exodus 18. So it's right before we just read here. So this is from the call of Abraham to the giving of the law, and so there is this time of promise that takes place. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons, God is orally promising all of them what is going to be taking place. So it's all about promise. And then chapter 19, which is what we just read, on up to the day of Pentecost, is then the law. So it is the time period of the law. So it's the giving of the law to the day of Pentecost. And it's the day of Pentecost when things really do change, because that's when the church comes in. So So that's, so the reason I bring this up now is because it's in Exodus where you see this big shift, where it goes from oral law to let's get it written down. So, and then chapter 20 of Exodus and following, we'll look at bits and pieces of that, but that's where you get your 10 commandments. So, and as I've said earlier, it's not just 10 commandments, it's 613. So there's loads and loads of commandments. We'll not make you memorize all 613. 10's enough. But,
What's the last part? And then what's that called?
that's the running up to the day of Pentecost is the law. Yeah. So anyway, so this is Schofield's breakdown of dispensations. So because you may hear people talk about in churches, I go to a dispensational church, and or we believe in dispensationalism or something like that. And I would say probably 90% of the people are going, I don't even know what that means. So, well, that's it. Okay, that's what that means. It's dividing the scriptures up into various periods of time. Now, some of these periods are very long. Some of the periods are very, very short. Like the age of innocence is very short. So it is helpful in terms of seeing what's going on. I wouldn't necessarily go and die on the hill over the head of it. Okay, so because the Bible doesn't actually explicitly say, okay, this is dispensation number 1, this is dispensation number 2, this is dispensation 3, and so on. It's just a way of kind of dividing it up. So, but what is very evident is that there is an Old Testament and there is a New Testament. And so the New Testament is about the new agreement that Jesus Christ ushers in. And as he said himself, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So because the law was full of how do you worship God? Well, in the Old Testament, that required a lot of sacrifice. The sacrificial system was huge. And so Jesus Christ came and fulfilled that so that you and I would not have to go and sacrifice a sheep. We wouldn't have to sacrifice a goat. We wouldn't have to sacrifice a heifer or any of those sorts of things, because Jesus was sacrificed once for all, the just for the unjust, so that we can have a relationship with God and him. So so the sacrificial system in the Old Testament is now done. It's fulfilled. It's over. And praise God for that. Now, a lot of the social system of the law, I would say a good bit of it still has jurisdiction. Now, there's certain aspects of it that maybe don't, like some certain dietary things, things of that nature. But 613 laws do cover an awful lot, So that's us for today. So next week we'll look at the 10 commandments a bit and some laws associated with that, and we'll start to climb a little bit in our flight. Where was Schofield from?
Right. But just,
I
remember years ago quite often you're telling of Schofield Bibles.
Yeah.
That would have been a big thing. Whether they were study Bible or I don't know. But I remember hearing
yes.
talking about a Schofield Bible.